Do you guys have a preference if we do Substance versus Sims first? Cool. Alright, so, Sims. I'm just gonna really quick, I set up the file for doing Substance, so I'm gonna go over, I think, if anybody is doing Sims in this class, are you guys doing stuff more like fire or things more like tiny shooting particles? Okay. I'll start with the fire. I know I also in last quarter did a little thing on particles, so I'll start with fire for grins. So. Alright, so if you guys want to do anything like fire or clouds, smoke, anything like that, and you want it to be animated, this is usually how you'd go about sort of setting that up. I'm just going to run through some of the basics of, things that will generally make stuff look better. I'll demo something that's going to look kind of like fire. But all of this stuff is going to be found under your FX tab in Maya. First thing you want to do, again, so like fire, smoke, anything like that is going to be a fluid. It's not like actually like water fluids, it's just what they call it in Maya. So what you want to do usually for your stuff is probably going to go into the fluids menu and set up a 3D container. If you open the settings for that, they'll give you some different sort of random options in here. They'll give you stuff for like the size of your fluid container. This is something you can modify later if you want to. You can also add emitters. By default, it's set to add one. So there's basically two parts of a fluid simulation. One is a giant box that holds your fluid and basically defines the bounding box for your fluid. The other thing is an emitter, and this is what the fluid is going to come from, basically. So there's also a bunch of different, settings for the emitter, which you can change if you want. You can switch them later as well. I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. And this is by default what it comes up with in your scene. So you can see we have basically just a fluid box in your outliner, and under that there is this little fluid emitter. So you can move this emitter anywhere within this little fluid box, and it's going to generate fire, smoke, whatever from this particular point. So I'm just going to go ahead and add like 500 frames to my time slider. Two really important things if you guys are doing pretty much any kind of sim, so like particles, end cloth, fluid stuff, anything. When this is simulating, it pretty much almost never works. Like, you'll notice if I scrub through my time slider, it actually seems to be simming okay, but as soon as I try to go back from like frame 400 back to 82 and scrub around, it'll usually sort of like break and it's like stops simming. It's a little bit more obvious with different types of sims, like this is a fairly low resolution one. But anytime you're previewing something like this in your viewport, you want to make sure that your playback speed is set to playing every frame. I usually do max real time, but again, if it skips frames, it's going to mess up the sim. So that is important. It needs to calculate every single frame. If it skips them, it's going to break stuff. But by default, so if we play this is pretty much what you get. It's doing its best to sort of go through and sim stuff. It's not, particularly fancy looking. It's also really, really low resolution. So that's usually the first thing that I'll sort of switch for this, is just the resolution of the sim. For grins, if you're rendering this in Arnold, this is what it looks like by default. You just get this sort of weird, hazy thing in a box. I'll kind of come back to the actual rendering later. But again, modifying the sim so it looks less trashy. So click on your fluid container and go into your attribute editor. So there's two different settings that I usually pay attention to in the container properties in terms of sim resolution and size. So if you want to change the physical size of this emitter box, you would do that from size. So I could make this like 20 by 20 by 20, or I could make this like super, super tall. Like if you needed, I don't know, some ridiculously tall simulation, this is what you use to change the size of this emitter box. What you don't want to do is scale your sim like this, like with the regular scale handles, it will make things look horrible. The reason that it will look terrible is that, I'll actually do this. The reason that looks really dodgy, so you'll notice on the bottom of the simulation, we have this sort of little grid here. This is basically, like, sims are calculated and their resolution is based on voxels. A voxel is basically a three-dimensional pixel, so it's just like a little cube. Think of, you know, Minecraft, basically. Pretty much is just Minecraft. If you scale your simulation box like this, you'll notice that this little grid, this sort of like preview of your voxels, stretches. So instead of having nice square, you know, resolution objects, you have these really long, strange, stretched out pixels. Highly undesirable. Never scale your simulations like this. Again, always use this size box here. If you're looking to actually modify the resolution of the sim, so you get a little bit more detail, it's not just like giant chunky smoke, you would do that with the base resolution here. So modifying, question mark, okay, there we go. So if we refresh that, you'll see there's a lot more little grids and boxes and stuff down here. This is going to do two things. It's going to make your sim calculate slower, but it will give you a little bit better resolution. So you can see, instead of having like one giant thick beast of a smoke clump, we get this nice, it's like a little bit thinner and you get a little bit more detail as it's sort of cascading around the edge of this box. So normally, if you're doing a simulation, what I would recommend is keep your sim around maybe like 40 to 60 voxels for your base resolution to test. And then once you're ready to actually do your final simulation, bump that up to, I usually do at least 80, 120 if you're feeling like super needing this to be really, really fancy or like getting up close to it. That's basically the container properties and just like the sort of sizing of your simulation. Does that make sense? Anyone have questions about that? Sweet. Other fun thing you can do if you're so inclined, you can move this emitter at any point during your animations. Like we can, you know, if we set a keyframe, that little smoke trail will actually sort of move with that sim. So you can make interesting stuff like that if you need to. If you wanted to have someone, for example, carrying a candle or something like that, you could, there's sort of two ways to approach that. You could either grab, you could just take the emitter, if you're only moving it slightly, and just move that. Or you could just take this entire simulation, attach it to the character's hand, and just kind of let it be carried along with the candle. The larger this box is as well, with higher resolution, it's going to make your sim go really slow. Anywho, so there's a few other settings that are relevant within the container properties themselves, and that is the boundary X, Y, and Z. So you'll notice, like by default, when we have the sim running, it'll sort of like hit the top of the container and then spread out and start leaking down the sides. Not always what you want for a sim, and this is where you can change that. So you can just say, if you say like none, for Y, basically what's going to happen is there's no boundary and the smoke is just going to kind of keep going up. It'll just sort of stop calculating after that point, but if you don't want, again, this massive buildup of smoke, just turn off that boundary and you should be good to go. And that is like super crazy basic setting up of a sim. There are other, you know, settings to make this look less gross and less like smoke. And I'm just going to go over some of the sort of basic ones, and I'll sort of like tack on extra attributes later. What I'm probably going to do, I have personal notes on this from when I set up, or when I was in the class. I might just edit them, but I'll probably throw a doc up on Drive for that. But if you go down, so this is under with your fluid container selected, you'll notice there's like sort of different settings here. There's stuff for temperature and fuel, which can be good for doing like explosions or other things like that. I'll come back to those later. But if we want to actually modify how this is working, you want to go into this content details tab in here. That'll give you a bunch of other settings. You'll notice they correspond. So we have density, velocity, temperature, fuel up here for contents method. And then we have density, velocity, turbulence, temperature, fuel. So all the stuff down here is like mirrored by these settings up here. So we'll just start by density. You can do different things here if you want to. So if we set buoyancy to be negative, it's going to actually drop your fluid instead of making it rise. Let me actually... Oop. All right. So you can do that. Density scale is basically sort of, I think of it as like how much fog or whatever your emitter is actually putting out. So you can play with that to get, whatever effect you want. Dissipation versus diffusion. If you look at these, so dissipation is usually going to be, it's hard to describe. Dissipation pretty much will like evaporate. So as this is generated, it kind of, think of it as like it has a shelf life and it'll just sort of like fade from existence. So that's dissipation. Diffusion, it doesn't disappear. You can kind of see it's just sort of like slowly filling up the container. So it just sort of disperses throughout the environment as opposed to just sort of like fading away into nothingness. So this could be interesting for doing, fog or some other kind of effect like that. Honestly, a lot of these I will sort of just like play with and see what they do. One of the ones, I have mixed feelings about this, but it's noise. So if you turn up noise, you can see it's like, if you turn it up too high, I think it looks a little bit weird and kind of jittery. But it can kind of make a little bit more of like an irregular sort of fog effect to your simulation. The other two things that I usually look at a lot, so this is like my personal favorite setting ever. Again, really good for sort of smoke or fire. This smoke stim will turn into fire in like a few minutes. But if you look again, under velocity, there's this swirl. What this does is you need higher resolution for this to make sense, and it's a little bit hard to see right now. But what it does is it basically gives a little bit of sort of turbulence or noise to this, but in a slightly more natural way. It's basically like tiny eddies of air sort of blowing through your sim and adding a little bit of regularity. And you can do some stuff with the texturing of this to make that stand out a little bit further when you render this. So I usually turn that up. Turbulence is, so the difference between velocity and turbulence, velocity is just sort of, think of it as like local effects on your existing sim. Turbulence is basically something within the fluid container itself. So if you turn on turbulence, you can see the sim is sort of like blowing around a little bit. So this is basically like wind, think of it as like wind in an environment. And it's going to sort of affect the way your sim moves through the fluid container. Could be good for flames. I feel like if you turn it up super crazy high, it gets like a little bit weird. One thing you can do, so if we do turn on turbulence, you'll notice that the container just gets full and turns into a sort of like weird block of sim. If we turn on dissipation, it'll sort of help to, like the older the particles are, they'll sort of like end up disappearing from the environment instead of just like staying there and filling your container awkwardly. And then we get this sort of like weird blowing, I don't know what this is, but weird blowing smoke effect. That's pretty much like the basic sort of default settings that come with a sim without turning anything else on. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've done so far? This is like kind of a weird little demo. All right. So before we get into a bunch of the other stuff, I do want to go over a little bit on rendering these a tiny bit. Wait. This is that weird thing where I consistently forget. So there are options if you want to turn on cast and receive shadows. And this is actually not a terrible thing to be aware of. Sims do take significantly long to render compared to other things a lot of the times. So if you're ever just doing something like really, really, diffuse, like a fog or something like that, and you don't want lots of self-shadowing, you can turn a lot of this off. It might save you a little bit in render time and not really cut down from the effect of your sim. One thing to be aware of, if you do go to render this, by default, your sim will shadow the ground. Normally it does it pretty nicely. I feel like a lot of times it's actually not a bad idea to leave that turned on, especially if you have a sim close to the ground. If you were doing something like a candle flame, tiny shadow. If you're doing something like a candle flame, you could probably turn that off and also be totally fine. Where am I looking for? It's, hang on. Shading. Yes, okay. So coloring this to turn this basically instant fire sim. You're going to want to go under the shading menu, and I'm actually going to set buoyancy positive and move my emitter down, and that way we won't have a stream of fire. All right, so let that sim. We have, you know, whatever this is. Great. So what we can do again under the buttons. All right. Under the shading menu in the fluid emitter box, there's a few different things that you can sort of mess with and play with. And these are going to look, if your sim looks nice in the viewport, it's probably going to look completely different when you render it, so you should be doing test renders of this as you're messing with these settings. But basically you can go through and sort of mess with the different colors of this if you want to. So you can make your own, you know, personal gradients and then have it based on a specific attribute of your sim. So in this case, we have color input as constant. If we set this to, say, Y gradient, you'll see that, make this even more obnoxiously obnoxious. What am I doing? Blue, sure. Wait, pink, great. Hooray. You'll notice that it sort of, again, we have this sim where it's like dark at the bottom, or sort of like bluish at the bottom, white in the middle, and then pink at the top, as per our blue to white to pink gradient. So there's different settings depending on what you want, where you can do things with this. The ones that are going to look a little bit more dynamic are doing something like having it based on density, temperature, or, you know, pretty much any of these things that are changing dynamically with your sim. So you might need to play with this a little bit and just like see kind of what that gets you. But you'll notice, like, so right now we have a very buttons. We'll have a very pink sim with a little bit of white in the center. You can go through and sort of like play with this input bias slider and sort of change how that's behaving. Or you can just sort of mess with the actual gradient itself to try to push that so it's colored in a way that you find more pleasing. So as we play this again, you can kind of see that like that color is dynamically modifying itself sort of with whatever your sim is doing. You can also mess with the settings of your sim itself and sort of change how that's working. So in this case, we have this work being driven by density. So there's a few different things, like in the density tab, you can modify to change that. So one, if we make this less dense, that's going to sort of affect the coloration of your sim. You can also look into things like dissipation and diffusion. So if we turn dissipation up really high, you can kind of see this visually where the densest area is like right around the emitter, and then stuff is like fading almost immediately. With diffusion, you can see the emitter is still really dense, and then the whole box is slowly turning pink. If we let this run, bump that up like, oh god, okay. If we bump that up higher, you can see that like the density is pretty much just growing exponentially in this box. So that's a really good actually visual between dissipation and diffusion. Again, dissipation disappears, diffusion diffuses. So if you were trying to drive something with density and you didn't want the whole thing sort of turning pink, use dissipation and not diffusion. But you can get some pretty interesting effects. You can see there's like nice sort of swirls. The other thing about sims, and this is probably not relevant if you're doing just like a candle flame, but a lot of the times to get a specific effect that you do need to go through and manually, just like as you're working, keyframe a bunch of these values, spike them in certain areas, change them as you go. Otherwise, usually it's not going to look super great. All of these values are keyable if you need to key them. So that's color. If we go through, I have no idea what this is going to look like rendered. Probably very questionable. Oh, that looks terrible. But you can see the color. It has changed the color of our sim. It's very gross looking now. And it, again, it looks a little bit different than in the viewport. So like in the viewport, we have the giant sort of pink mass of grossness, and that doesn't show up as much in the render, which is why it's always good to go through and do test renders of things as you go. But yeah. So the rest of this stuff is actually kind of dependent on other things. So opacity is, again, you can hook up, you can do pretty much whatever you want for this. You can do some really crazy stuff with it. You could just have it, ooh, God. You could just have it be based on a Y gradient, which I don't recommend. But you can have this be based, again, temperature, density, kind of like whatever, whatever works for you. And then you can make some really, really strange effects with this. If you make like really spiky grids, you can sort of like cut some areas in and out in a very, very strange and aggressive way to achieve, again, completely different effects. So this time we have a little bit more sort of like noise showing up in the bottom of the sim than we had previously. Those are pretty much, so this is, if you were shooting for like, I want this to look like fire, you could color this less idiotically, and it would render something that kind of resembles fire. In this case, I'm just going to keep it cotton candy flavored for now, because it's kind of funny. But this is the basic sort of sim that you would normally do, is sort of like basic stuff, again, without adding temperature or fuel into the equation. This is enough to make something that looks like a sketchy little fire. If you do the coloring better. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Cool. So really quick, I did just want to touch on two things. So one, I'm going to add a little bit of swirl into this, because it gives you pretty nice looking sort of like jiggle to the animation. But I do want to show you the difference between, so I'll let this sim to say frame 80, 86. So this is the resolution of your simulation at at a base resolution of 40. If we bump this up to something like 90 and restart our sim, it's going to take way longer to sim, but you can see that there is way more visually interesting stuff happening in that sim. Like, right, like all of a sudden it gets super more sort of like depthy and dimensionally. And there's a lot more sort of interesting swirling effects taking place in the simulation. So this is one of those instances where, again, when you're coming to do your final sim, you should bump your base render up, especially if you're going for like grandiose fire effect. It's pretty necessary. For something like a candle flame, you could get away with like a little bit lower. The other thing that you can do if you're ever, so like, if we are shooting for fire, so right now this is a little bit sort of slow feeling. The best way to test a timing of a simulation is to just do a play blast. It's pretty much the only way to actually get an accurate representation of timing for your sim. Again, using the viewport, since you have to play every frame, it gets pretty laggy sometimes. But where is things? Wait, there's a button for that. All right, I'm going, oh no, that's a, okay, cool. Sorry, I was thinking of a different thing. All right, so I did want to touch on one or two more things. So for one, so right now we pretty much only changed the settings for the fluid itself. So what you can do is also modify things for the emitter. So you can change like the type of the emitter if you want to. I'm just gonna leave it as Omni for now. You can change how much stuff is being emitted. So if we set this higher, it's going to basically pump out more of this fog. And you can see that makes like an even crazier sort of swirling effect there. You can also turn it off entirely if you're just like, you just need a quick puff of smoke. Maybe you're doing something, you know, there's like a magic guy and he's like, haha, throws a thing on the floor and like disappears in a poof of smoke. Key that to whatever you need. There's also sort of other settings that you can mess with. You can change the sort of density method. I usually just leave that as add, honestly. But basically, if you're doing something driven by density, so if I set this to 4, it's going to sort of kick out more density per second of fog, basically. So there's, again, stuff you can do in your emitter that will affect the settings that you have in the fluid container itself. If we set this to like 0.2, it's going to kick out significantly less density per second. That's going to change how it looks in the emitter and also how we've textured it, since a lot of our textures are based on density. And then there's other things you can do, which is like heat and fuel. And this is what I sort of want to talk about. I'm going to really quick set this back to the defaults. But heat and fuel are kind of cool if you're trying to do something like an explosion, where you have it's basically like a massive wave of heat. So like something triggers it, and then all of a sudden like it sparks it, and then it just sort of grows from there and like consumes things in the environment and just sort of like expands that way. So what I'm going to do is go into my fluid container again, and scroll down, and you just want to, it's still my emitter. Sorry, let me close some things real quick. All right. All right, so under this contents method stuff, we have temperature and fuel set to basically not be calculated or set to 0. If you want to use these, normally I use dynamic grid. It's going to look a little bit more realistic. And it's basically just calculating stuff like a regular sim instead of like a gradient from, you know, the bottom to the top kind of thing. So I'll turn on temperature, and it's not going to make any super obvious immediate changes usually to begin with. But what it will do a lot of times, so for one, it gives you actual access to these settings here. So right now, like, fuel is grayed out because we don't have fuel turned on. So what we can do if we want to is mess with the temperature scale and all of these other settings. So this is something where you can use, like, if you've ever looked at fire or smoke, like hot air rises, so the higher the temperature, basically you want your sim to be more buoyant. So what you can do is sort of mess with the temperature and like how the temperature disperses or degrades, as well as the buoyancy of your object. So we set this like 50, theoretically it'll rise faster, and then as it cools down, it'll sort of start falling or rising slower. So you can kind of play with stuff like that. You can also play with pressure a little bit. There's different settings for pressure for like density and a bunch of other things. Basically what that is the hotter things are, like it kind of like the more pressure is put on it. So you can also think in terms of like, if you're thinking of density, if you have a bunch of stuff that's packed really, really tightly together, it's going to be pushing more aggressively on each other and be like more inclined to move away from each other. That's basically what pressure is for all of these, except in this case, since it's under the temperature setting, it's being driven by temperature and not density. But you can see it's doing some really, really interesting things with like sort of like crazy flickering that it has going. And there's like lots of kind of cool eddies of air sort of like in here, where it's just sort of like diffusing that way. And then again, a lot of these things are kind of pretty similar, where we have like dissipation if you want the heat to sort of vanish as the sim progresses, versus diffusion where the heat will just sort of collect in the box until everything is just sort of hot all over eventually. And just like depending on the look you're going for, you can sort of like mess with some of those. There's also turbulence in the heat. This one, in this case, is more of like a local setting as opposed to sort of environmental. But again, there's all these settings, and you can sort of use them however you need them. What you can do in this case is also come down. So remember before, like in the shading tab, we were doing like color and all this other stuff? Incandescence, by default, is mapped to temperature, and I usually leave it like that. So basically, what it is, oh wow. That's weird. I was like, why? It sounds like children. And I'm like, there's children in the hallway. That was really weird. All right, so incandescence by default is, again, mapped to temperature. And this is basically going to be if we want this to glow. It's usually pretty hard to actually figure out what this is going to look like unless you do a render. Stop. Ha. Boop. And let's do a thing. All right. All right. So you can see, I mean, here we have our like really goofy little fireball. But if you look in the center, so like where previously this was blue in the viewport, well, I guess not so much anymore, but basically this is being incandescent, it is glowing with this yellow color based on the settings that we have here. So I've actually yet to find a particularly great way to make this like super crazy bright. I know there's a way to do it, I just honestly don't remember off the top of my head. But you can kind of go through and just like mess with things that way. So this is usually what I do, again, if we want like super crazy bright burning fire, just pump incandescence up. At some point it will override whatever you've done for the color. So I usually don't worry too much about color to begin with because usually I'm making fire. But what you can also do is go through, and this is where playing with the opacity is kind of fun and can get you some really interesting effects. Okay, great. Let's do this instead. All right. So with opacity, just for grins, it's set to density. I'm going to swap it to texture. That looks terrible. Mess with the input bias a little bit, see what that does. In this case, I think density was probably a better setting for that. But what you will notice, so I'll set the input bias a little bit higher. Depending on what we do with the opacity, you can get all of these crazy little sort of ripples, and like this is where you really start to pull out the detail of the fire and of your sim, or your smoke or whatever you're doing. I'm actually going to rip the gradient control open, so if you just grab this little arrow button, it'll pull it up bigger so you can actually edit it. So what we can do is, again, if we just sort of like punch a bunch of little holes into this, you can see that it's like really pretty dramatically changing how the sim is being rendered. So I use opacity a lot, and usually whenever I do something, I do some kind of crazy like spiky graph like this, again, because it does a pretty nice job of actually picking up the textures in the simulation. Like there's a lot of sort of nuances that you can't see if you just leave it with the basic opacity graph. But honestly, like this is pretty much most of the time how I do simulations for things. You'll also notice, like in this particular instance, I've left opacity super low for most of the sim. Don't break, don't break, don't break. Don't break. Okay, I don't know what it's doing. But I mean, that is pretty much like weird, goofy fire sim. And again, do note that it looks completely insane in your viewport, and it looks pretty decent in the render. So always test render as you're doing simulations, because you never know what this is going to turn into. That's pretty much most of the stuff that I wanted to go over in terms of how to sort of set up a sim and make it behave in a somewhat fire-like manner. Does anybody have any questions on that? Okay. There are two more things that are really important when doing simulations. One is caching. Caching is basically saving your simulation so you can access it later. And this is, again, extremely important. Caching. Everyone always forgets to cache it. So caching does like three things, and I do actually have a little document in the student resources tab that is literally just caching info. It goes over how to cache and why you want to cache and some extra stuff that you can do with caches, which I'm not going to go over, but this is here if you need it. What caching is it goes through and it simulates your sim, and it saves that information so that, one, you can scrub through your simulation on the time slider and you don't need to recalculate it every time you're doing things. And two, and this is important, if you're rendering on different computers, sometimes different computers will calculate your sim differently. So if you render half of your sim on one computer and half on the other sim, they will look different, which is clearly not what you want. The other thing, specifically regards to rendering, is if your sim, say you're rendering frames, 1 to 100, your renders crash at frame 50. If you start rendering from frame 50, your sim will be broken unless you have cached it. So you would need to then go through and re-render the first bunch of frames from your scene. It's very annoying and convoluted. Basically, always cache stuff when you're done with your sim or you're happy with it. To actually do a cache, you just go up to this Ncache tab in this the FX tab, and there should be a button for create new cache. You want to do, in this case, Maya Fluid. N object is going to be, something like a dynamic objects, or like Ncloth, I think, is also that. Any kind of fluid where you have like a fluid container, do a fluid. If you open these, it'll give you different options of like where you want to stick your cache. I'll just leave it as a default folder. You can name it, which I recommend. I just leave the cache format as, whatever it defaults to, usually. I will also usually, there's different settings here that you can sort of do. I usually just leave it as one file per frame because I'm kind of lazy. And then you can just decide, how often, or like where you want the cache to start, end, run from. I usually just enter these values manually, so I'll do like 1 to 120. And then you can save all of the different stuff that you want to cache. So in this case, I am using temperature. I'm not using fuel. So I could theoretically just turn that off and not save that data. I usually, just to be safe, save all the stuff. But once you go ahead, you should be good to then hit apply with your emitter selected, and it's going to go through and it's going to simulate basically up through the frame that you selected. It's going to go through and just, again, save all the stuff. I will find somewhere. So if you don't already have a cache folder, it will make one automatically. And you can see that, like, if you go into the cache, this is what it's doing. It's literally just saving a file for every single frame, and saving your information that way. So what I should be good to do now is if I scrub through this, it actually behaves properly, and it behaves pretty much like any other object you would have in your scene. You'll notice if I go past that simulation to frame like 200, it's like, no, and it gets really grumpy. So don't do that. Like, this is, again, the importance of caching. If you need to scrub through your stuff, you should always cache it. That's pretty much caching. Anyone have any questions on caching? Okay. Like I said, there's a bunch of other stuff you can do. Like, you can combine caches, make multiple caches, blend between caches. It's all fairly straightforward. It's also in the doc, and I imagine a lot of you probably aren't going to need to do that, so I'm not really going to cover that right now. But that's pretty much the sim. You should be good then at any point to go through and just like render this with, whatever. So this is the other thing that I did want to sort of make a note of in terms of simulations is, so here we actually have a decent example where this is casting a shadow on the ground. You can render, depending on the render times you're looking for, you oftentimes can render a simulation in Maya software. And it will work usually totally fine. So here's our Arnold render. I'm just going to stop this. If you do want to render in Maya software, what I recommend is turning off everything else in your scene and then just rendering that. So in this case, it looks pretty trashy, but it also rendered in 1 second compared to this 4-second thing. So again, this would be, if you're planning on rendering in software, texture it to be designed to render in Maya software. Okay. But this is legitimately what I did for pretty much all of my simulation when I took like the sim class. I rendered almost everything in Maya software because the render times otherwise were astronomical. And what you can do is comp this in, if we look at If you look at like the alphas for this, it's basically just black on the background, like it's only rendering the stuff with the sim. So you should be able to really easily just stick this directly on top of whatever you're actually rendering, and that would be a decent way to save some time with your candle flames or whatever other weird stuff you're rendering. The only time I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that is if you need obvious shadows like this, because that's going to be really hard to get. Or if you need to have this and have it be like really, really bright and like illuminating something in your background, it's going to be a little bit of extra compositing to get this illuminating things correctly. And again, beauty of caching is no matter what computer you render this on, all your frames are going to look the same, which is always delightful. Ooh, wow, that looks really weird without the background in it in the Arnold one. All right, that is pretty much my weird, goofy bit on fire sims. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. I do have one very, very silly bonus thing for you guys, and that is fake, I'm just going to say for the sake of now, fake milk simulations. So what you can do is you can turn your simulation into geometry. So if you grab your fluid container and you go to Modify, Convert, there's a button for Fluid to Polygons. If you click it, it will do this. And now as you go through your sim, you have this very strange looking, mushy, exploding mess of polygons. There are some settings for this. So for one, probably the base resolution is excessive, but if you scroll down in your fluid container, you'll notice there's a tab for output mesh. And you can set this to be quads if you want, which will give you this actually kind of like, it does kind of look like rounded Minecraft effect. It's pretty weird. You can also add some smoothing to that, so basically it's just going to go through and like round everything out a little bit so it's not as Minecrafty. But this is potentially a weird way if you ever just need like, oh my, this is what happens when you break the sim. That's actually, if you're looking for this effect, it's not bad. It kind of looks like a shower of Dippin' Dots. But you can do this if you want to. It's kind of, I've never found a use to do it, but it can be an interesting way. Just maybe if you're looking for like a little bit of extra interest in your scene, you can do something like this. I'm gonna kill this existing emitter really quick. I promised you a bad milk sim, and I intend to deliver on that bad milk sim. So I'm just gonna make a 3D container. I will make it taller. And in this case, so I want this theoretically behaving as a liquid. I'll also give this a tiny bit more resolution. So we sim it by default. It's gonna make a sad trail of smoke going upwards. I'm gonna go and set the, if I can find it, I'll set the buoyancy down to like -5. It's gonna drop the smoke. And at this point, we should be good to do a convert fluids to polygons, and it'll give us this really strange effect. And it kind of looks, I need more frames. It kind of has the strange effect of like liquid being dropped into a container. And it will, unless you turn on dispersion, it will literally just slowly fill this up with fluid. Like you can see it's basically like fake fluid filling this container. So you can play with the settings to make this look a little bit more interesting. You could also actually add, if you put like a cylinder within this emitter and made that a collidable object, it would actually fill the cup instead of just a cube. But it is potentially a strange and maybe interesting way to get a little bit more sort of interesting effects. Again, if you're ever looking for something for some reason like this. Add a tiny fountain in the background or something, I don't know. But yeah, just add a little bit of swirl and it makes it a little bit like jigglier and kind of more interesting looking. But yeah, that's my weird fake milk sim. It is very sketchy and weird. Okay. Questionable. But yeah, that's pretty much that. Also with this, last thing, you can assign this whatever shader you want. So if you throw out like an Arnold shader or something like that and a milk preset, you have then a glass of milk. that's my weird bit on simulations. Apparently, it is now the end of class. Does anybody have any questions before I free you guys? Yes?
I mean, it wouldn't matter much since you say you can just put objects within the container, but is there any way to like change the shape of the container itself? Or is it always just like a box?
It's pretty much always a box. So you just need to sort of be as careful as possible with, you want, the most efficient sim is going to be smaller than a large sim, especially when you start adding like lots of base resolution to this. Which is why, so again, if you're making something like a candle flame, you could do something like this and then take your fluid and just parent it to the cylinder so that theoretically, like if you move this cylinder, theoretically it will take the sim with it. And that's what I would recommend for a camera flame is, again, just like basically put a tiny emitter attached to a candle. That looks super weird. The other, so sort of like worst case scenario is, so that, I mean, that's what it'll do if you move the simulation itself. This is probably like a weird example. If you're looking for, it'll literally just take the whole simulation and shift it with no regard to wind or anything like that. If you're shooting for like a candle walking, you'd actually want to move the emitter itself. That's the way you're going to get the nicest sort of flickering of that flame interacting with the environment, if that makes sense. But yeah, worst case scenario, if you're doing like a giant fire sim, you do just need a huge box for the fire. It's pretty much always a box. Cool. Any other questions? All right, get out of here. Have a good next week.